The ceremony had been planned for 3 years. That was the detail no one mentioned aloud, though everyone in the great hall carried it the way you carry weather, present in the body before it is named. 3 years of preparation. 3 years of the kingdom's quiet, collective expectation building toward this evening, toward this room, toward the moment when Queen Seraphine would stand at the head of the founding table and lead the rite of continuance, as every queen before her had done. She stood instead at the far end of the hall, beside the third pillar, in a gown the color of deep water, speaking to no one. Not because she had been placed there, because she had chosen it, the precise distance from the table that said present without saying central. Close enough to be seen. Far enough that the absence of her at the head of it might read, to a generous eye, as deference. There were not many generous eyes tonight. The rite itself had proceeded. Lord Aldrich, the king's eldest counsellor, had spoken the old words in a voice made for ceremony. Low, measured, carrying the particular authority of a man who has performed a function so many times it has become indistinguishable from his body. He had not looked at her. That, too, was a choice. King Dorian stood at the table's center. He was good at this, the stillness of formal occasions, the way he inhabited a room without appearing to consume it. Seraphine had once found this quality beautiful. She still recognized it as a skill, which was not the same thing. He spoke the responses to Aldrich's prompts. He lifted the ceremonial cup. He did everything required of a king whose queen was standing 30 feet away instead of beside him, and he did it without a single visible adjustment, as though the arrangement were not an arrangement at all, but simply how the evening had unfolded. This was his gift. She had married it before she understood it fully. The whispers began before the formal portion ended. She heard them not as words, but as a shift in the room's texture, the way a gathering changes when it has found something to organize itself around. Heads that had been angled toward the table began angling elsewhere, brief, calibrated. The whispers were not loud, they did not need to be. A hall full of people who have known each other for decades does not require volume. It requires only a shared question, and the question had arrived. Where should she have been? Not why is she not there, that would come later, with sharper edges. For now it was only the shape of it, the outline of an absence. The table had a head, and the head was empty of her, and the room was deciding what to make of that. Seraphine held her cup and looked at the far wall. She had prepared for this moment. She had told herself she had prepared for it. Standing here in the actual texture of it, the specific quality of being observed and found wanting by people who had once straightened when she entered. She understood that preparation was not the same as readiness. You could know a thing was coming and still feel it arrive. Dorian moved through the room after the formal rite concluded. She watched him without watching him, a skill she had developed in the opposite direction from his. Where he could be still and unreadable, she had learned to observe while appearing to be observed. He spoke to 3 ministers, laughed at something Lord Aldrich said, rested his hand briefly on the shoulder of a young military attaché whose family had recently been elevated. He was working. He was always working. She had once called this dedication. He came close to her, twice. The first time, a court physician named Devan stopped him before he reached her. Something administrative, low and urgent, and Dorian redirected without effort. The second time he reached her. He stood beside her for a moment. He touched the back of her hand, briefly with 2 fingers. A gesture that from a distance read as marital warmth. "You look well," he said. She looked at him. There was a man she did not know at the edge of her vision. A provincial visitor, she thought, someone without the fluency to read the room correctly, who had just asked someone near him, in a voice not quite low enough, why the Queen was not at the table. She could see the answer being formulated by the someone near him. She could see it being chosen. Dorian heard it too. She knew because she knew his hearing, knew the particular quality of his attention when something arrived that required management. His eyes moved toward the sound by perhaps 3 degrees. Then they moved back. He said nothing. The room continued. She understood, in the specific silence that followed, that she had just watched him make a decision, not a passive one, not an oversight, not an omissit, a decision made cleanly, in less than a breath, with the full knowledge of what it would allow the room to do next. He was not cruel. That was the thing she always came back to. Cruelty would have been easier to hold. What he was instead was strategic in the way that very powerful people become when strategy has worked for long enough that it stops feeling like a choice and starts feeling like a nature. He excused himself to speak with a minister. She stayed by the pillar. The provincial visitor's question had reached its answer now. She could tell by the quality of the silence that had replaced it, not resolved, settled. The way a room settles when it has decided something. She did not move from the pillar for another hour. When she finally crossed to the smaller antechamber to collect herself before the evening concluded, she passed the founding table. The head seat was empty, the ceremonial cloth still arranged for someone who had not arrived. She did not stop. She did not look at it. That too was a choice. The meeting was not meant for her. That was the first thing to understand. Lord Aldrich had requested a private audience with the king 3 days after the rite, and the word private had been communicated to the household in the usual ways, a particular arrangement of the morning schedule. The eastern corridor left unattended the king's personal steward stationed at the far end of the hall rather than the near one. Seraphine had learned to read these arrangements the way sailors read water. She had been reading them for 11 years. She was not in the room. She was in the adjoining library, separated from the king's receiving chamber by a door left open 2 inches for the circulation of air, because the library's eastern window had been sealed against the winter, and the room became close by mid-morning. No one had thought to close the door before the meeting began, or perhaps someone had thought of it and made a different calculation. She did not move when she heard Aldrich's voice. He was not a malicious man. She had considered this carefully over the years and returned to it now, listening. Lord Aldrich was a man who had served the crown for 40 years and who had developed, in that time, a complete faith in the idea that the crown's stability was identical to the kingdom's well-being. He was not wrong, exactly. He was something more difficult than wrong. He was useful in the way that made certain kinds of damage invisible. "The court is unsettled," he said. His voice was the same voice he used for ceremony, unhurried, certain of its own authority. "What happened at the rite has not resolved itself. People are still asking." "People ask," Dorian said. "When people ask long enough, they answer themselves. You know this." A pause. She heard the king move, the particular sound of him shifting in the carved chair he preferred for these meetings, the one with the low back that forced a posture of attentiveness. "What are they answering?" Dorian asked. Aldrich took a moment. Not hesitation. Consideration. There was a difference, and Aldrich always chose consideration. That the Queen was not where she was expected, that there may be a reason for that, that the reason may reflect on the crowns. Another pause. Continuity. The word landed in the library with the weight of something dropped from a height. Continuity. The court's preferred abstraction for every expectation that had a woman at its center. Seraphine had heard the word her entire marriage. It was the word they used when they meant something specific but wished to preserve the appearance of speaking generally. She had learned not to flinch at it. She flinched now alone among the shelves, because there was no one to perform composure for. "The Queen's conduct is not in question," Dorian said. "No one has questioned her conduct." Aldrich's voice was even. "What they are questioning is the absence. Conduct and absence are different matters. The absence is visible. The reason for it is not. When the reason is not provided, the court provides one." Another silence. Longer. "What would you recommend," Dorian said, "to settle it?" She pressed her hand flat against the shelf beside her. She was not certain why. Something to hold. Aldrich's answer was not elaborate. It did not need to be. he said simply, that if the king were to indicate, not state, not announce, only indicate that the matter of the rights arrangement had been one of the queen's own choosing, for reasons that remained private but were hers, then the court's questions would find a natural place to rest on her. Where, Aldrich noted, they appeared to be resting already without any indication required. The court is efficient, Aldrich said. It does not need direction, it only needs the absence of correction. She heard the king receive this. She could not see him, but she had been married to him long enough to know the sound of something being filed, not agreed to aloud, not refused, simply received and placed where it would be useful. "Thank you, Aldrich," Dorian said. That will be all. She learned the rest of it second-hand, as Aldrich had predicted she would. Her lady-in-waiting, Carla, young, careful, genuinely fond of her in the uncomplicated way of people who have not yet understood that fondness is a form of exposure, came to her in the afternoon with a particular expression of someone carrying information they would prefer not to carry. Carla was not a gossip. That was what made it worse. She reported only what she believed her queen needed to know, which meant she had heard it from enough mouths to consider it established. "There is talk," Carla said, "that the right arrangement was by your request, that you asked to step back from it, that there were reasons." Seraphine was at the window. The garden below was winter bare, the topiaries stripped to their shapes. "Reasons," she repeated. "No one has said what kind." Carla's voice was careful. "Only that they were yours." She nodded once. Carla took this as dismissal and moved toward the door, then stopped. "My lady, if you wanted to, if there was something to be said, thank you, Carla." The girl left. Seraphine remained at the window. Below, a groundskeeper was moving along the garden's eastern path, doing the winter work, cutting back what wouldn't survive, clearing space for what would eventually grow. He moved without hurry. The work was simply what the season required. She thought about the meeting she had not been meant to hear. She thought about the phrase, absence of correction. She thought about Dorian's silence after it. Not a silence of shame, not a silence of conflict, but the silence of a man who had received a solution and recognized its shape. She had one question she needed answered. That evening, when the household had quieted, she went to him. "Was it Aldrich's idea," she said, "or yours?" He looked at her for a long moment. His eyes were steady. He was not a man who looked away. "The situation," he said, "is being managed." She held his gaze for 3 full seconds, then she nodded, a single small movement, and left the room. She had her answer. Chapter 3. She built her own wall. The woman's name was Marin. She was 63 years old, the widow of a duke who had died with more honor than money, and she had been a fixture of the court long enough that people had stopped seeing her as a person and begun seeing her as a condition of the room, like good lighting or the smell of wood smoke in winter. She was not political. That was the precise nature of her power. She had outlasted 4 significant court realignments by being genuinely uninterested in any of them, and the court had rewarded her indifference with the one thing indifference rarely earns: trust. She came to Seraphine on a Tuesday in the small receiving room off the east corridor without announcement. This was not rudeness. It was the particular intimacy of someone who has known you long enough to understand that announcement creates performance, and performance was not what she had come for. She sat across from Seraphine and folded her hands in her lap and looked at her directly. "I know what the court is saying," Marin said. "Most people do," Seraphine said. "I also know it isn't true." The room was quiet. A fire burned low in the grate. Outside, the sky was the specific white of winter afternoons that never fully brighten. "You don't know that," Seraphine said. Not a correction. A test. She wanted to see what the older woman was carrying and whether she was prepared to carry it all the way. Marin's expression did not shift. "I know you. I have known you for 11 years. I know the difference between a woman who has failed at something and a woman who is being handed a failure that belongs to someone else." She paused. I also know the king. The fire settled. A log shifted. There is a way, Myrn continued, to let the truth reach the surface without it becoming a flood. A private word to the right person. Nothing announced, nothing confrontational. The story simply changes shape, quietly. Her eyes were steady. You would not have to say anything yourself. I would need only your permission. Seraphine looked at the fire. This was what she had not anticipated, not the offer itself, because she had understood that someone would eventually offer something, but the specific quality of it. Maren was not asking her to fight. She was not proposing spectacle or strategy or any of the things that would have been easier to refuse. She was offering something small and dignified and genuinely possible, and she was offering it with the plainness of someone who expected nothing in return. No alliance, no debt, only the restoration of a record. It would have worked. That was the thing Seraphine turned over as she sat there, as the fire burned and Maren waited with the patience of a woman who had learned that waiting was not weakness. It would have worked. A private word to the right person. The story changing shape. She knew exactly whose ear Maren would have chosen, and she knew the ear would have listened, and she knew that within a week the court's understanding of the right would have begun, quietly, to correct itself. She thought about Dorian standing at the founding table, lifting the ceremonial cup, performing continuity without interruption, because she had been standing 30 feet away, absorbing the interruption for him. She thought about his voice in the receiving chamber. The situation is being managed. She thought about what the kingdom looked like from his chair, the particular view from that height, the way certain disruptions became, from that distance, simply problems of arrangement. She thought about what would happen if the story changed shape. Not to her, she had catalogued her own losses with clear eyes, but to the thing she had spent 11 years building alongside him. Not their marriage, exactly. Something larger and more impersonal than their marriage, the structure, the alliance, the careful architecture of a reign that had held because both of them had held it, in different ways from different positions, with different tools. She had never been under any illusion that her position was symmetrical to his, but she had believed until recently that it was reciprocal. She was no longer certain what she believed, but she was certain of this: the moment the story changed shape, the disruption would be his to manage. And she had watched him long enough to know that disruption for Dorian was never merely inconvenient. It was destabilizing in ways that moved through the court like weather, unpredictable, widening, touching things it had not been aimed at. She told herself this was her reason. She examined it carefully, the way you examine something you found in poor light, turning it toward a cleaner source to see what it actually was. It held. The reasoning was real. It was not the only thing that was real. I can't give you permission, she said. Maren looked at her for a long moment. Not with disappointment, with recognition. The expression of a woman who had suspected this answer and had come anyway, because respect sometimes requires the offering of a door, even when you know it will not be opened. You are protecting him, Maren said, not an accusation. A statement of fact offered plainly. I am protecting what we built. Those are not always different things. No, Seraphine said, they're not. Maren nodded once, slowly. She stood, smoothing her skirts with the unhurried movement of someone who knows the conversation has ended and does not require it to have gone differently. At the door, she paused, not the pause of someone who has thought of one more thing to say, but the pause of someone who wants to leave something in the room. You are not the first woman in this position, she said. I want you to know that I see you in it clearly, not the version the court sees. You. She opened the door. That will have to be enough, I think. She left. Seraphine remained in the chair for a long time after. Then she stood and straightened her dress and went to the mirror above the mantel. She looked at herself for a moment, not with the searching quality of a woman looking for damage, but with the assessing quality of a woman deciding what to do with a material she has been given and cannot exchange. She thought, if they are going to look at me, then I will give them something to see. Not a defense, not a performance of innocence. something more durable than either, a posture of such complete composure that the blame, over time, would begin to look like it had misunderstood its subject. She would not fight the narrative. She would simply be so entirely herself within it that the narrative would eventually seem, to anyone watching carefully, slightly imprecise. It was not the choice Marin had offered her. It was smaller and harder and entirely her own. She returned to the east corridor and walked without hurry toward the sound of the court assembling for the evening meal. Chapter 4. The price compounds the friendship had not been dramatic. That was the thing about it, the thing Seraphine found herself returning to in the days after it ended, the way you return to a room you've left something in without knowing what. It had not been the kind of friendship that announced itself. No grand confidences, no history of crisis survived together, no particular moment she could point to and say, here is where it began. It had simply accumulated, the way certain things do between women who move in the same spaces for long enough and discover, without ceremony, that they have been paying attention to the same things. Lady Innes was 41, the wife of a trade minister, precise in her opinions and generous with them only when she trusted the recipient. She had trusted Seraphine. For 6 years that trust had expressed itself in small, consistent ways. A seat saved at formal dinners. A note delivered when something in the court required navigation, a particular quality of directness that Seraphine had come to rely on the way you rely on a compass, not constantly, but absolutely, when you needed it. The ending was not dramatic either. There was no confrontation, no letter, no visible withdrawal. Inez simply stopped. The save seat appeared, one evening, to have been saved for someone else, a minor baroness, pleasant, inoffensive, recently elevated, and therefore useful in ways that Seraphine was currently not. The notes stopped. At a reception in the 3rd week after the rite, Inez crossed the room toward Seraphine, and then, at a distance of perhaps 15 feet, changed her course, smoothly, naturally, toward a cluster of ministers' wives, in a movement so fluid it could almost be mistaken for accident. Seraphine watched it happen and understood it completely. Inez was not cruel. She was, in fact, a woman of considerable intelligence, and considerable intelligence, in a court environment, produces a specific kind of calculation. Proximity to someone under scrutiny carries a cost. And that cost is distributed unevenly, and women in Ass's position could not afford the distribution. Seraphine did not blame her. She had spent 11 years in this court, and she knew exactly how the arithmetic worked. She had simply never been on this side of it before. She absorbed it the way she had absorbed everything since the rite, without visible response, without the particular rigidity that signals suppression. She had become skilled, in recent weeks, at a kind of softness that was actually structure, yielding on the surface so the thing that hit her didn't find an edge to push against. The reception where Innes changed course was the same reception where Dorian was warm to her. This was the detail that stayed. He was good in public, she had always known this, but that evening he was particularly good, with the specific quality of warmth that reads to outside eyes as a marriage in good order. He brought her a drink she hadn't asked for. He touched the small of her back when they moved between groups. Once, across the room, he caught her eye and held it for a moment with an expression she recognized as affection, because it was affection. She had never doubted that part, which was perhaps what made the rest of it so difficult to arrange inside her chest into something that made sense. His warmth cost him nothing tonight. She smiled when he brought the drink. She matched the register of his warmth with the register of her own, and they moved through the room as they had always moved, and people who watched them saw a king and queen whose marriage had the texture of something real. What they could not see, Innes across the room, choosing a different course. The empty seat at the table that had, for 6 years, been a small constant. The specific weight of losing something that had never been large enough to defend and was therefore too small to mourn publicly and too real to dismiss privately. What they also could not see, the moment Dorian could have stopped it, it came early in the evening, before the room had fully assembled. Seraphine had been standing with a small group, 2 ministers' wives, a young attaché, Lord Aldrich's daughter, when Lord Aldrich himself joined them and steered the conversation, with the practiced ease of a man who steers conversations, with the practiced ease of a man who steers conversations the way other men breathe, toward the subject of the right. Not directly. He never moved directly. But the shape of what he was saying pointed there, and the group received it. And someone, the attaché, too young to have developed adequate caution, said something about the Queen's role in the evening's arrangement that was technically a question, but functioned as a verdict. Dorian was standing 3 feet away. She did not look at him. She looked at the attaché with an expression of mild patience and said something about the season's ceremonial calendar that redirected the conversation without engaging its premise. She had become good at this. She had had to become good at it. What she knew without looking, Dorian had heard the question. She knew his hearing. She knew the 3-degree movement of his eyes. She knew the precise set of his shoulders when something arrived that required management. She knew what a decision looked like in his body before it surfaced, if it surfaced in speech. He chose a sentence about the trade negotiations. It was a good sentence. It moved the group entirely. Within 30 seconds, the attaché's question had been so thoroughly displaced that to return to it would have required visible effort, and no one in that group was willing to spend visible effort on something the king had just moved past. He had done it to protect the conversation, not to correct it. The distinction mattered. One was maintenance, the other would have cost him something. She returned to her rooms that evening later than usual. She did not sit. She stood in the center of the room for a moment in the particular stillness that had become familiar, not peace, not distress, but the stillness of a person taking an internal accounting. What was here before? What was here now? She went to the writing desk. She did not write anything. She opened the small drawer on the left side, the one she had always used for personal correspondence, for things that required discretion, and she looked at it for a moment. Then she closed it. She went to the window. The city below was dark and lit in parts, the way cities are at night, not uniformly, but in clusters, in the places where people had gathered for warmth or work, or the simple human requirement of not being alone. She stood there until she was ready to have a face again. Then she turned from the window and prepared for bed. Chapter 5. He sees what he has done. He found her by accident. That was the only honest accounting of it. He had not gone looking. He had come to the East Library for a document Aldrich needed before morning, something administrative that could not wait. And the library connected to the small conservatory through a corridor that was rarely used in winter, because the conservatory itself was too cold for comfort after dark. He had not expected anyone to be there. The door was ajar. The light inside was low, a single lamp turned down, the kind of light that is not meant for reading, but for something that does not require seeing clearly. He stopped before he reached the threshold. Seraphine was sitting on the stone bench beneath the conservatory's central window, the one that looked out over the eastern garden. She was still dressed. It was not yet late enough for bed, but she had removed the formal elements of her evening, the structured pieces that a queen wears the way a soldier wears armor, and what remained was simply her. She was not weeping. He registered this first, with a relief that he recognized in the same instant as self-serving. She was sitting with her hands in her lap, turned upward, loosely open. Not a posture of prayer or deliberation. A posture of a person who has set something down and not yet decided whether to pick it up again. She was looking at the window, which in this light showed her only her own reflection. He stood in the corridor and watched her look at herself for a moment, not with vanity, not with the assessing quality he had seen from her in mirrors when she was preparing to be seen. With something he could not immediately name, and then could, the expression of a person taking a private account, tallying something, the face of someone who is honest with themselves in the moments no one else is present. He had married her partly for this quality without understanding it fully at the time, the precision of her internal life, the fact that she moved through the world with the same standards in private that she maintained in public, a consistency he had always respected and occasionally found inconvenient. He understood, watching her in the conservatory's low light, that he had spent 4 months treating her consistency as a resource. She had not broken. She had not threatened, had not maneuvered against him, had not done any of the things that the wives of powerful men occasionally do when the weight becomes too much. She had absorbed. She had rebuilt herself inside the absorption. She had made choices, real ones, with real costs, that he had never asked her to make, and she had made them quietly enough that he had been able to receive their benefits without having to look at them directly. He had not looked at them directly. He was looking now. The garden below was dark, and her reflection, her hands were still open in her lap. He watched her close them, slowly, the fingers curling inward, and then open them again. A small, private movement, the kind of thing the body does when the mind is working through something that has no clean resolution. He thought about Ines. He knew about Ines. He knew about most things in his court, which was the requirement of his position and a fact he had always regarded as a form of competence. He had watched the friendship end from the correct distance, and he had made no note of it in any internal accounting, because the friendship was not a political variable and therefore registered to the part of him that ran the kingdom as ambient, as weather. Standing in the corridor, he understood that he had made a significant error in his categorization system. He entered the conservatory. She heard him immediately, she always did, and turned her head without urgency, the way she turned toward things she had already determined were not threats. When she saw it was him, something in her face arranged itself. Not performance, more like bracing. The small preparation of a person who has been managing their expression in company for so long that the reflex now fires even in private. He sat beside her on the bench. Not at a marital distance, close. He had not decided to do this. His body had decided. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Outside, the winter garden held its shapes in darkness. "Marin told me she came to you," he said, "in the autumn." Seraphine was quiet for a moment. "Marin is discreet." "She is. She told me only that she had offered you something and that you had declined." He paused. "She wanted me to know that you had declined. Then she's less discreet than I thought. She wanted me to understand what it had cost you to decline it." He kept his voice even. "She was not subtle about the purpose of telling me." Seraphine looked at the window. Her reflection looked back. "I made my own choice," she said. "I don't require you to account for it. I know you don't require it." The sentence sat in the room. He did not apologize. He had considered it in the corridor and had arrived here without one, because an apology would have been a form of conclusion, and there was no conclusion to offer. What he had done had worked. The kingdom was stable. His position had not been disrupted. These were facts he could not apologize away without dishonesty, and whatever else he was not dishonest with her. "I see what you've been carrying," he said. "I want you to know that I see it." She turned and looked at him then, directly, with the precision she reserved for things she intended to assess accurately. She held his gaze for a long time. "I know you see it," she said finally. "You've always been able to see clearly." A pause. That was never the question. He held her gaze. He did not look away. He owed her that much. She turned back to the window. He stayed beside her for a while, long enough that it was not a brief visit, not short enough that it was sufficient. And then he rose and left the room, and did not correct the record in the morning. Chapter 6. The shape of what remains. A year is long enough for a story to become history, not corrected, not resolved, simply absorbed into the layer of things the court understands without discussing the sediment of a kingdom's ongoing life. The right of continuance had occurred again. 3 months prior, with adjustments that were never formally explained. A different format, a shared arrangement at the table. Lord Aldrich had presented it as tradition evolving, which was the language courts use when they need change to look inevitable rather than chosen. No one had asked questions. Questions, by then, would have required the court to revisit something it had already finished understanding, and courts are efficient, as Aldrich had said. They do not spend energy on what has already been filed. What had been filed, the Queen had been absent from her role. The reasons were hers. The matter was closed. Seraphine had watched the revised right from the table's centre, not restored to a position because she had never formally been removed from one, but occupying it differently now, with the particular authority of a person who has learned to stand in a room without requiring the room's interpretation of her to be accurate. This was not bitterness. Bitterness would have been easier in some ways, cleaner, more portable. What she had instead was something harder to name, a precise, unsentimental understanding of the structure she moved through and her location within it, and a self that had been rebuilt over the course of a year from materials she had found only after the original construction failed. She had not forgiven him. She had not decided not to forgive him. The question had simply stopped being the relevant one. The spring reception was the first large gathering of the new season. The court assembled in the main hall with the collective energy of people who have endured winter together and are relieved without quite admitting it to be back in the same room. There was music. There was the particular warmth of a hall full of people choosing, for an evening, to be uncomplicated. Seraphine moved through it well. This was not performance, or it was, in the way that all public presence is performance, but it was no longer a performance of anything other than herself. She had stopped, sometime in the autumn, trying to manage the court's perception of her from within it, and had started simply being in it with her full attention, and the difference was visible in ways she had not anticipated. People who had been cautious approached more easily. People who had recalibrated their distance found themselves, without clear reason, recalibrating it back. She had not fought the narrative. She had simply continued existing at a high standard of herself until the narrative began to look, as she had once hoped, slightly imprecise. Inez was there. They had spoken twice since the withdrawal, brief, formal exchanges at the kind of events that made brevity natural. Inez was not cruel in her distance. She was simply maintaining the position she had calculated, and Seraphine understood the calculating well enough not to require more from her. What had existed before was not available. What existed now was a formal cordiality that both of them observed with perfect manners, which was its own kind of loss, and also its own kind of dignity. Tonight Inez crossed the room toward her, fully, without course correction, and said, "You look well, my lady," with an expression that carried, beneath its social surface, something Seraphine recognized as an attempt. Not restoration. Something smaller. An acknowledgement that the distance had been chosen, and that choices can be regretted without being reversed. "Thank you," Seraphine said. "So do you." They spoke for 4 minutes about nothing consequential. Then Inez moved on. Seraphine watched her go and felt the loss again, briefly and clearly, the way you feel the shape of something that is no longer there when you move through the space where it used to be. Then she turned toward the next thing. Dorian found her near the hall's eastern windows late in the evening, when the reception had thinned to its final quarter and the music had softened to something ambient. He stood beside her, and they looked out at the garden together. Lit tonight with lanterns along the path, the spring plantings just beginning to assert themselves in the beds below. He had been working the room all evening with his usual precision, and she could see the slight settling of his posture. That meant the formal portion of his attention was complete, and what remained was for himself. "It's been a good season," he said. "It has," she agreed. They stood in a silence that was comfortable in the way that long marriages produce comfort. Not warmth exactly, but familiarity. The knowledge of another person's rhythms. She knew when he was finished speaking and when he was gathering towards something, and she waited. "I've been thinking," he said, "about the conservatory." She looked at him. About that conversation, he kept his eyes on the garden. "I have thought about it more than you might expect. I believe you," she said. He turned toward her then. In the lamplight, he looked like what he was, a man in his 50s who had governed well and carried the cost of it, and who was not, at his core, without conscience. She had never believed he was without conscience. That had never been the question either. "I don't know," he said carefully, "how to give back what the year took." She considered this for a moment. Outside, the lanterns moved slightly in a wind she couldn't feel through the glass. "You can't," she said, not harshly, simply as information. He nodded once. He had known this. He had asked anyway, she understood, because some things need to be said aloud before they can be properly understood as true. They stood together for another moment. The music continued. The court moved around them in its patterns. She excused herself before the reception concluded. In the corridor outside the hall, alone for the first time all evening, she stopped. Not from distress, from the simple requirement of a moment that belonged only to her before she returned. The hall's sound reached her through the closed doors, voices, music, the low continuous presence of a court in function. Inside, Dorian was working the room's final hour. Inside, the story of the year that had passed was settled and filed. Inside, everything was, by every external measure, in good order. She stood in the corridor and breathed. She was not the woman who had stood beside the third pillar, holding a cup, watching the room decide where to look. She was not less than that woman. She was not more. She was what that woman had become after a year of carrying something heavy in full view of people who had never seen the weight. She straightened. She opened the door and went back in.